Welcome, first of all, to everyone who's here already to Change for Good. It is April 23rd. It's 11 o'clock here in Toronto, and it's the 6th week. Very hard to believe that we're all working at home. And I'm so pleased to have these conversations, so privileged to be here today and really welcome all of you. And COVID remains a crisis, but also remains an incredible opportunity for positive change. And that is what Change for Good is all about. And that's what we've done over the last many weeks and will continue to do so. So every week I have this special opportunity to have a conversation with a social change leader about how COVID is affecting their organizations and what they think needs to be done differently to solve COVID-19 and to be more innovative in how they address other social problems in the future. And today I have the very, very great pleasure of speaking with Stephen Huddart of the McConnell Foundation. I've known Stephen for a long time, and the McConnell Foundation is an organization that plays a very special role in the area of social innovation, also Indigenous reconciliation, urban resilience, and also impact investing. When I spoke with Stephen earlier this week, it was so clear that he knows so much about so many things that are important to all of us that the hardest part was going to be to focus our conversation. So today what we're going to do is to really hone in on social innovation, which is an area that I think we both believe has become such a priority for every organization whose responsibility it is to contribute to social change. Without innovation, many organizations simply won't exist. And with innovation, organizations are going to be able to make an even bigger difference. And that's what we're hoping to contribute to today. Last week, Danielle Zanotti mentioned something which I loved. He said, today, everything is possible. And I couldn't agree with that more. So today, Stephen's going to share his perspective on why social innovation is so important and also give you ideas of what you can do differently. We look forward to your questions as we go through the conversation. We'll try and answer as many as we can. And welcome, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Paul, and hello, everyone. Paul, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for doing this. And it's such an important time, and the ability to privilege really of being in conversation with you and joining the others in this series to reflect together on where we go from here, what the nature of this crisis really is, what's it showing us in terms of vulnerabilities and opportunities to build back better, to shape society in a way that would increase our chances of bequeathing a world to future generations that is one that we would be proud to be part of and to have helped to steward. So it is a crisis, and as Churchill said in the Second World War, and several others have repeated since, we should never let a crisis go to waste. I was reflecting before our call that this is a crisis that is giving us a unique, I think, vantage point to look at where vulnerabilities in our systems exist and who needs to step up and how we can reimagine and rebuild better coming out of this. It's certainly true that there is a lot of suffering and mental, physical, societal disruption going on, and I don't want to diminish that for a moment. We have people working heroically in our healthcare sector to keep people alive. We've got governments stepping up in extraordinary fashion to ensure that we come out of this without crashing. And everybody globally, around the world, people are voluntarily staying at home, social distancing, and so on. It's a remarkable moment of shared vulnerability, and I think one we can be thankful that it's not worse. We have an internet, we have global systems that enable us to respond. We've got a research committee that is working feverishly to come up with vaccinations, cure, and so on. So I think we're going to be able to look back at this and say that we came through it with remarkable contributions of social solidarity and compassionate interventions and so on.
Mm.
But I know that what you wanted to talk about today was, where are the sort of the innovation opportunities, and how do we think about what to do short term? And there's certainly some needs, some very urgent and pressing short-term needs. But there's a midterm question here about how do we come out of this? What's it going to look like? We don't know when it's going to end or even how it's going to end. So there's a whole zone of uncertainty there that we can and are thinking about, how we can, come through this and in the best possible shape. And then we have the long-term questions that I think are important to this. And I guess because we do so much work in the reconciliation space, I'm just constantly reminded and aware of the fact that before Western society, came to be Western society, indigenous populations lived in this world, on this planet successfully for millennia. They're still here. They share and have enormous reservoirs of wisdom and have been poorly treated by us settlers. And so we're in this era of reconciliation now that is another dimension of the transformational moment that we go through. And I've just came across this phrase recently that stuck with me, which was no trauma, no transformation. And so I think that the trauma that we're going through now takes us to the very root of who we are as people, as communities, as nations. How do we transform our pathways forward so as to be resilient, inclusive, and sustainable? It's a great moment to be alive in, and one of great peril and promise.
Well, there's so much to be learned from the indigenous communities. What you said reminded me of something I heard an elder said to me a while ago, and which strikes me as particularly relevant today. He said, when our people walk forward, they face backwards, so they don't forget their language, their culture, their history, and the things that are so important. And I think that's something that we should all remember today as well as we're doing this. A sense of humanity is so important. Stephen, just to kick things off, one of the things, and again, you and I have talked about social innovation, had that opportunity for a long time. But for me, when I think of change for good, I think of organizations that are able to have a bigger difference in a shorter time at a lower cost. When you think of change for good today, what does that look like for you?
Well, that's a great opener. I think this idea of greater good over shorter time at lower cost is something that we could maybe just spend a little bit of time kicking around. And I think there is a short term, there's an immediacy to this moment and the work we're doing. It's about making sure that food gets to places where people are lacking it, and we've been looking at the erosion of voluntary sector capacity to engage seniors as volunteers in Meals on Wheels programs, for example. I think, well, how do you fix that when the people aren't there to deliver the food to the people who needed it? What's broken there, and how do you go there and work with that? We don't have the answer yet, but I think the need for short term is really in a way a proxy for longer term and for the systems that support the ways we look after each other. The healthcare system is stretched to the max. The long-term care system is substantially broken in places because our short-term, our immediate needs, I welcome you, I feed you, here's where you sleep, and so on. Those are not as well organized and as well structured, and we're not paying enough attention to some of those things as we have to. So there's some really important short-term stuff to look at for sure. But we've also got longer term issues to address. And we'll just maybe going to stick with health, and let's take food and just mash those together for a moment. So some things that we're seeing as healthcare workers in, the busiest hospital wards dealing with COVID-19 patients are coming off shift, exhausted, and there's no food. The cafeteria is closed. They've got a long way to get home. The grocery store is closed. It's like, why aren't we, and we are looking at how do we shore up that? How do we ensure that the very people who are looking after us are looked after? Where's the childcare for them? We just did a survey with Healthcare Can, surveying hospitals executives across the country to say, what are your priority needs? And for the staff, interestingly, the number one need that the staff cited was communications technology for patients. It's my son's birthday, or my grandmother's sick. I can't talk to her. And it's the staff who are experiencing that stress themselves. I think, could we just please get iPads, better Wi-Fi, screens in front of these people so they can connect with each other? You and I are enjoying a great connection now with a lot of people, but there's all these places in our systems that if we look short term, we can do much better. And so that's one angle on this. I think we also want to be able to look at these other two horizons, the midterm and the long term, are also, I think, really important to look at.
I absolutely agree. And what you said reminded me, this made me think about, so you're talking about organizations. Very often the organizations that we depend on, not just are many small organizations, but look at the healthcare system. These are large institutional groups where change is difficult in a large organization. So here you have organizations that have to be much more nimble than they were in the past to help solve new problems that didn't exist before. What are your thoughts, or are there any specific examples that you've seen of organizations that are institutions that have been able to make that shift?
Yeah, there's quite a few actually, and I think one of the places where we're seeing tremendous innovation right now is in the financial sector, and the work that can be done to provide income security, and I should say we're talking financial sector and the public sector really, the provision of income security to people who've lost their jobs, or to students who won't get jobs this summer. I mean, these are massive structural changes that are being tested in real time and providing, I think, a level of social and financial innovation that we've just never seen before. This is a crisis, and I think we have to acknowledge that the public sector is really stepping up here. But I think, we've got, in so many systems, educational organizations are looking at retrofitting their buildings and repurposing the lands they're on to become better community assets going forward. There's work going on in something we're involved in with the Institute for Investigative Journalism at Concordia University. Is just putting together a pandemic response and storytelling network, linking up universities and students and professors with media organizations across the country to better track what's going on and tell the stories of under-examined vulnerable populations whose stories aren't being told, and the solutions that are being generated to address them. I think we're at the beginning of a very big expansion, exponential growth in social innovation at multiple scales. So any organization lots of organizations are moving operations online now in order to first to operate, but also to deliver services. We're talking to people in the disability sector who are looking at this as a way of an opportunity to improve online support for socially isolated and disabled people. There's lots of work going on around the ability to support people with mindfulness techniques. And so what are the good ones out there? What are the ways that we can help people who have behavioral issues and so on? So the delivery of therapeutic interventions online. There's lots of great work going on in those areas, but in every direction you look, in the energy system, in transportation, food, this is an extraordinary period of learning and testing. And Milton Friedman once famously said that, in a time of crisis, you look around for ideas that were sort of lying around there and you put them to work. Well, social innovation's been, running labs and testing and developing prototypes all over the place on all kinds of things. And suddenly we're at a moment when we really need these things. So organizations are making good use of them.
Another thing that we've always felt was a priority, and I love your thoughts on, which are, innovation. We have people like us who have the opportunity to work in this area, and sometimes the people who we are innovating on behalf of are not part of that conversation. People with lived experience of some of the issues that are happening, and look at the many people who are so vulnerable today. What are your thoughts about the ability to involve more people with lived experience in social innovation today? And again, have you seen any examples of that you might be able to share?
Yeah, this is such an important question, Paul. I think that phrase, nothing about us without us, that movement leaders and participants espouse is a really vital, essential principle right now. We're part of, here in Montreal, we're part of a collaborative effort among a number of foundations to support our local United Way, Centraide, in addressing immediate community needs. And we're fortunate here in having 17 neighborhood community councils that are made up of ordinary citizens, many of them with lived experience, so-called, who have been meeting for many years and who've been supported in coming together to determine priority community needs over the last 4 or 5 years through a collective impact project that we and these other foundations have been supporting. That infrastructure is so important now because in the COVID-19 moment that we're in, those councils are able to pinpoint needs very quickly, are able to take questions and bring them to the communities and come back with answers to prioritize and pinpoint where initial response is needed, but also to look at the systemic issues together. And just want to mention that, another advantage of the United Way system, and it's coming together in a beautiful way right now, is the use of the technology and the data that they are able to generate from the 211 system that they operate, also helps to map where our vulnerabilities are, where are the under-addressed areas, how do we learn and respond in real time. So this combination of on-the-ground legitimacy and participation and technological capability to map the larger systems is, I think, just pointing us in a direction of the integration of the social and the technological that will, if well governed and well supported, give us great strengths going forward in terms of the resilience and responsive capacity we need for this and future crises.
That's a fantastic example. Thanks for sharing that. So you mentioned well-funded. I think I'd be wrong in missing asking you. You're running one of the largest, if not the largest, I'm not sure how it ranks, but very large charitable foundation in Canada. So there's two parts to the question. One is how are you as a leader of this organization applying maybe some of the things that you've talked about in terms of what other groups to the McConnell Foundation itself? And how is the McConnell Foundation perhaps looking at the way it funds others in this kind of new context? I think many people here would be both on the funding side and also on the organizations that receive funding. Would love to hear your thoughts on you as a leader and what you're doing differently there.
Right. Well, thank you, Paul. And I would just quickly say, first of all, me as a leader really is, behind me stands a board of a family that supports me and a great team of very hardworking people who are really here to serve the issues that we're talking about. And so this is an opportunity that I hope we're stepping up to. But just to mention a couple of things I think that are important. One is, we grant typically somewhere between $20 and $25 million a year, which is about 4% of our endowment. But our board and we believe that this is not a time to protect the endowment. This is a time to step up. And so for the next year, we're going to increase our granting by 25% to 5%. So we'll be somewhere above 30, 32 million in grants this year. for now, and at least that's the first step. And I think that's something that I know a number of other foundations are taking. Bill Young and I think there's a couple of dozen foundations now have stepped up to do this. And I would encourage any foundations or funders interested in knowing more about this. There's a new website up just today called Give5, G-I-V, number 5.ca. It's an important time to be giving more, and in addition to increasing the overall amounts, providing flexibility. Daniele was talking about this last week and saying, if you're on the ground, you're dealing with issues, you're closer to what's needed, you decide. You have our funding, there's more available, there's a degree of flexibility, in other words, that's important to introduce into granting now. But it's not just about granting, it's also about the other supports we provide through programming. And it's not easy to be leading a charitable organization through a time like this, or a foundation. And so we've launched with the help of a former director of the BC Yukon Red Cross, a woman named Kimberly Namrava, an initiative on the Innoweave platform, innoweave.ca, about leading through crisis. And so talking to people, reaching out, having those conversations, providing online mentoring and support for people who are leading now is something I think that experienced leaders have a responsibility and an opportunity to do. So that would be a second thing, is just looking for where you can provide emotional reassurance to people who are on the front lines. We mentioned earlier the needs for frontline healthcare workers, and we'll be sharing, Healthcare Can will be sharing data about what some immediate needs are there and for the people who are looking after us. But there's also the question of, and this gets into a bit more of the longer term, is what are we doing with our investment dollars? Right. We're looking at a period now, Paul, when a lot of significant number of charities and not-for-profits and local businesses are going to be struggling to keep the doors open. We know, the numbers are stark. And I think we have to be having a conversation about a sector stabilization fund for the charitable sector, made up of grants, zero interest loans, and technical support. And we're also prototyping, because I know you're a business guy, and with social business is such an important part of this whole landscape, that I wanted to mention that we're prototyping something with in a couple of cities in Edmonton and Ottawa, just getting underway this week, where people can make donations to local businesses, donations and pre-purchase of goods and services, just to help them stay afloat. We know there are federal programs in place and provincial programs, but if you love your local streetscape, your local greengrocer, bookstore, whatever, we hope to be able to put in place very quickly an opportunity for you to support those businesses in getting back on their feet when this is over.
I love it. There's a question here, or actually a few questions that are great, and one kind of reminded me of what you just said, Stephen. Viral, excuse me if I haven't pronounced that right, has a question. She says the query is on impact investments amid COVID-19. And how is McConnell leveraging impact investments at this time? You're doing that.
Yeah, well, impact investing is growing very, very quickly, as your questioner probably knows. I was just talking this morning with a colleague. Something that we do with a couple of other foundations here in Montreal, and I'd love to see this expand nationally, is we have a loan guarantee program with the Desjardins Credit Union. And so we put up capital, we put guarantees in place that enable that financial institution, it's a very big one here, to make low interest loans to social enterprises. And we make a 1% return on capital that is essentially still in our portfolio. It's just a guarantee. And so we're looking at that instrument and that relationship and saying, well, what if we first of all gave up that 1%, and what if further we donated the interest cost for social enterprise networks to be able to access capital quickly. The example we're looking at is a network of Meals on Wheels organizations in Quebec, who, given the loss of volunteers and older staff, are struggling to stay afloat right now. They have an association, they know what their needs are, they know who could use capital. And so we're looking at an instrument that would enable the bank to provide that service of capital to keep things going with a zero interest loan or an interest where we pay the interest, in fact. So this integration of charitable giving with investing is a huge area for creative investment, and for foundations, I think an underutilized tool. The other area that's really, I think, so exciting right now, and I almost hesitate to use that word, but we want to be able to finance outcomes now. We want to be able to say, what's it going to take to reduce homelessness by 50% in our community, or to increase school completion rates by X%. We worked with social impact bonds for a long time. They proved the point. They are cumbersome. They take a long time to put together. We're very pleased to have one running in Manitoba right now, introducing the profession of Indigenous doulas to support vulnerable mothers with their kids. That grew out of a community lab that's been run by a group of Indigenous women for the last 5-6 years in northern Winnipeg. It was their idea. They tested it, prototyped it, researched it. It's now a $3 million test to run that at scale, and potentially will reduce by thousands the number of kids that are being taken into state care, foster care. So these opportunities are all around us now, but we can't get at them with one social impact bond at a time. We need a new relationship between our sector, the public sector, and the financial sector to fund outcomes at scale.
I love it. There's another question. There's, I said to Stephen earlier this week, the biggest challenge is how do we keep this to 30 minutes? And we only have a few minutes left. It's a good example of this, but I do want to ask another question here that Lynn has sent in, which is for organizations that are operating on the front lines, and obviously very in a very immediate sense. And you talked about the medium term and the longer term. Her question is, when do you see organizations on the front line ready to be thinking about and planning for the future? And you've used the term building back better. And what kind of support will they need to be thinking about the future?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I think something that really needs to be taken up by leaders in our sector. We're looking at an initiative that we hope to launch by the end of the month, where we can provide funding to organizations to do the assessment, to get prepared, to prepare for and assess what are the options for a new business model, for a new for a merger, for a new coalition to come together where certain functions are shared, where there's a focus on addressing new vulnerabilities, on moving some operations online, and so on. So with the technical assessment grant or program, it's then, we hope, going to be possible to identify those high potential projects, initiatives, and so on, that we'd like to get this going, but we would very much like to be doing this with other funders, and eventually with governments and other partners as well. But I think we see that need as being super important. How do we help organizations get back on their feet and keep serving the communities that depend on them through this process? So community foundations, United Ways, private foundations we can do a certain amount, but we're going to need government help for this as well. And let's not leave the private sector out of this either. I mean, I think there's so much leadership in private companies that I think this is a time for us to be all working together.
Well, thank you. Stephen, we're out of time, sadly, but I wanted to leave everyone with one thought, which is from you. You mentioned this earlier this week. I still think about it. A few people have mentioned it today, which is really the opportunity to, as you said, build back better. And that means different things to different people, and it means collaboration, it means impact investing, it means a lot of different things. But I think that that's something as a priority that we have to keep in mind and not lose that opportunity. I would also really want to say that I think it would be fantastic for you and I to have another conversation, maybe in a month or two after, when we see more of what's happened, because we're I think where the opportunities for change will be even more. So thank you, Stephen, first of all, and to your colleagues at the McConnell Foundation. We so appreciate you taking the time. Also wanted to thank my colleagues at Impact, who as always remain 100% committed to helping solve social problems. I want to thank everyone here today, and also just remind everyone that you'll receive a copy, a link to this conversation that Stephen and I have had tomorrow. The other thing I wanted to mention, a few people have asked for this, and we'll send along with this some links to some of the sites that and platforms that Stephen mentioned before. Interweave, which is an incredible organization, which I mentioned, and the Give5 website. I think it's called Give5. We'll send you a link to that. Anyone who's interested can also register on impactcorp.com for our next conversation, which will be this time next week. We have the great pleasure of speaking with Tabitha Bull, who is the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, which will be super interesting and really important for everyone who's interested in social change to hear from Tabitha. So thank you again, Stephen. Thank you to everyone participating today. Keep up the good work, build back better, and please stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Bye, everyone.